Welcome. Today we're going to be looking at some of the intergovernmental organizations that help bring stability and development to the global economy. You've probably heard of some of these organizations that we'll discuss. We're going to look at a handful of them. There are more that we could discuss, but today I hope that in this video we can discuss the most prominent or important of those organizations. And these are organizations that help to build connections between nations, to help stabilize nations that are in crisis economically, and in general, just to help with the global economy to continue to grow peacefully and to benefit all members of the nations that make up these intergovernmental organizations. We'll look at a handful of the most important, and hopefully at the end of this video you'll have a better sense of what each of them does and what their purpose is. The first of these intergovernmental organizations we'll be taking a look at is the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund. So I want to talk a bit about the purpose of the IMF. First of all, the IMF exists to stabilize the international monetary system. And when we talk about monetary system, we're talking about, of course, currency exchange, the value of currency, the trade deals, trade alliances, and those sorts of things. The IMF wants to promote global financial cooperation and trade because they believe, as an organizational purpose and as a sort of a belief structure for the member nations, they believe that cooperation leads to economic growth and stability, and that's good for the people of those nations. To facilitate sustainability, the IMF seeks to reduce poverty around the world. And so a lot of the programs that the IMF introduces or supports are efforts to alleviate poverty in countries where it exists, or to help avoid the circumstances of poverty in countries that are rather developed, or at least on their way to becoming developed. And then the IMF also serves as a safety net for countries that are in financial distress. So if a nation is going through a particular economic crisis, could be due to multiple factors, including environmental catastrophe, things like tsunamis or hurricanes or typhoons or earthquakes, those kinds of situations and circumstances create great financial strain on individual nations, and the IMF can stop in and essentially provide some kind of a payout, or some kind of a protection for those nations. In a sense, it functions a little bit like homeowners insurance, or any kind of insurance for that matter, where an insurance company will come in and make sure that though those nations will have to, participate in their own recovery, they also have help with some of the financial burden of it. I'll give you a few examples of where the IMF has stepped in recent years. The first would be in Egypt. So in Egypt, the IMF approved a loan package, which helped expand some existing programs that brought the country through a group of or set of economic challenges that they were facing. They were having trouble with foreign exchange shortages, and they had high debt. And the IMF program linked reforms within their system with a sort of a provision of funds to help move them through this difficult period. And this is very common for what the IMF does. It will step in where a nation is in trouble, and they will provide some help financially to help those nations get through that trouble. However, there's often strings attached in a good way. Those nations often have to reform some aspects of their economic system in order to receive those funds. The Ukraine is another example. So the IMF provided a multi-billion-dollar loan through its extended fund facility to Ukraine. This support was in part to aid the country to allow it to maintain some fiscal, external, and microeconomic stability amidst the war that's ongoing there. So the program focused on strengthening governance and institutions to help support long-term recovery and reconstruction. So it was meant to be an assistance or an aid to Ukraine to help them move through this period of war. Unfortunately, that war in Ukraine is still ongoing, and so a lot of times these programs through the IMF are needed to be renewed in an ongoing way, and sometimes that funding falls through. One last example of what the IMF does in Sri Lanka, the IMF approved a 4-year loan in order to help the country address a severe economic crisis that they were suffering. The program that they set up in Sri Lanka is aimed at restoring debt sustainability, meaning that they wanted to make sure that the Sri Lankan government could make payments towards any kind of debt that it had on its books, and it allowed them to rebuild the foreign currency reserves, and then help them with some structural reforms within their government system. So these are just examples of how the IMF works, how they step in amidst crisis, and they seek to help nations kind of move through those difficult times. The next intergovernmental organization we'll take a look at is the World Bank. So the World Bank has 3 primary purposes. One, it provides financial assistance, particularly to poor nations or nations that are less developed. It also helps deliver technical expertise. Many poorer nations need help with modernizing their economies, and so the World Bank can step in and assist with that by bringing in experts to provide information on how to do that. And then they also promote sustainable development, and that's also through training and programs, sometimes loans or grants, but all usually focused on places around the world, nations where economies are underdeveloped or undeveloped completely. So I'll give you a couple of examples of how the World Bank has served nations in the past several years. One example is from Laos, or the Laos People's Democratic Republic. So a World Bank funded project helped improve access to early childhood education there. And of course, providing better education is one way to improve economic growth. As you have a more educated populace, you then find more initiatives within the economy. As those kids grow up, they start businesses. They create new economic opportunities. They sometimes go abroad, which does often supply remittance or payments back to the home nation. So all of those things can be a result of improvement in education, and that's something that the World Bank seeks to do. Another example is in Bangladesh. So the World Bank supports one of the world's largest off-grid programs in Bangladesh, which provides millions of people in more rural areas with some reliable access to clean energy. And of course, if they have access to energy, that means they can have solar home systems, solar irrigation, pumps, and clean water access, better health outcomes in general, and then having access to reliable energy opens up new economic opportunities for people who might want to start a business and need energy to run factory machines or to use computers to provide some service within the community. So yeah, all of this goes to help build better economies in nations where people are quite poor and needing that kind of assistance. So the World Bank The World Bank is a great intergovernmental organization that has done lots of good around the globe for many years now. The next organization you've probably heard of before is the World Trade Organization, the WTO. So the World Trade Organization has several different purposes. One is to administer trade agreements between individual nations or groups of nations. They also provide negotiating forums so they can come in and help two nations negotiate a trade deal, rules about how much trade will occur, if there are tariffs involved, what the rates are on the tariffs, and so on. They also help with dispute settlement. So if two nations are disputing with one another and they claim that the other nation is using unfair practices for some reason, then the World Trade Organization can come in and they can help to resolve those conflicts and try to reestablish some kind of a mutually beneficial agreement between these disputing nations. They also help with trade policy reviews. So if a nation wants to make sure that their trade policies, the way that they might sell goods and services across borders, if they want to make sure their policies are all above board and legal and meet international standards, then they can have the World Trade Organization take a look at that. And then they also help with technical assistance. So they have lots of experts who can come in and provide information for nations who are hoping to trade broadly. They can help with the laws that govern trade. They can help people better understand the types of digital transactions that are also nowadays part of international trade, and so on. So they offer a lot of different services to the members of the WTO. I'll give you an example of a dispute settlement. So they have the WTO has helped with many different trade disputes. A notable one that you may be aware of is a, a, a dispute between China and Switzerland, and so essentially China and Switzerland challenged the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum, arguing that it was not justified by the WTO's rules. So the WTO came in and helped negotiate and that dispute and try to find a settlement that made all nations involved in it satisfied. In 2022, the WTO reached a landmark agreement to curb harmful fisheries subsidies aimed at promoting sustainability by prohibiting subsidies for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. So essentially what this means is there were some nations that were using harmful policies or economically harmful policies. They're actually helping subsidize certain fishing industries within their own nations. And this meant that then other nations with fishing industries, fishing as in like going out and collecting fish for your filet of fish sandwich, these nations were arguing that countries that were subsidizing the fishing industries were sort of artificially lowering the value of their fish, and then that was making them less profitable, essentially. And so the WTO stepped in to help negotiate through that disagreement. And then one more example of how the WTO has helped in a global crisis. So they played a role in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the members of the WTO agreed during that pandemic to waive some of the intellectual property protections for vaccines that exist between nations in order to sort of amp up the ability to manufacture these vaccines so that more people could get access as quickly as possible. So just a few examples of the way that the WTO has stepped in to be of assistance to its member nations whenever they are having some kind of a conflict or an issue or an internal crisis of some sort. The next intergovernmental organization we'll look at is the G20. So in 2025, the G20 was in South Africa. That moves each year. So if you're watching this after 2025, then you are maybe aware of where the G20 might be this given year. But the purpose of the G20 is to become a forum for international economic cooperation. Its primary purpose is to address major issues related to the global economy, such as financial instability, development, climate change, immigration, and those types of issues that affect many different nations. So the group's members represent about 85% of the global GDP, or over 75% of international trade, and about 2/3 of the world's population. So that's why, even though it's just 20 nations, it's actually covers a great deal of the global economy. A key or prominent recent policy example from the G20 is the New Delhi Leaders Declaration, which was adopted in the 2023 G20 summit in India. A key outcome of this declaration was a commitment by members to triple global renewable energy capacity by 2030. So this is an economic goal, or a environmental economic goal. It's a significant policy because it creates a concrete goal for the major aspect of climate change mitigation. And so the G20 member nations came together and agreed upon the terms, and have at least in some part or in some ways sought to live up to that commitment. Although I will mention that the G20's policies and commitments are non-enforceable, so there's not really another governing body that can levy sort of consequences to nations who don't live up to those commitments. But the spirit of the G20 is to try to work together and come to these agreements. On your screen, you can see the member nations, at least as of the time of this recording. So you can see Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, Turkey, or what we've previously called Turkey, the United Kingdom, and the United States. There are also some regional bodies, so the African Union and the European Union are also considered sort of regional bodies that are connected to the G20. They represent groups of nations, but they still have a presence on the committee, right, as part of that organization. So yeah, these member nations are what we mean when we talk about the G20. And as I mentioned before, they really do, even though it's just 20 nations, they really do encompass a very large portion of the global economy. The last organization we're going to discuss here is the OECD, which stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So the purpose of the OECD is to promote economic growth, to foster global trade and investment, to encourage good governance, and to address social and environmental challenges. So this really is a forum in which the member nations can come and join together and share information with one another. It's basically a way for nations to share their own data and analysis about economic issues. In some ways, the OECD is it's not setting out to make a lot of policy, but is more interested in trying to help provide a system of best practices for different economies around the world. Their goal is to make the countries they work with stronger, fairer, and cleaner. In other words, stronger economically, fairer in their laws and practices, and cleaner in the environmental impact. And so a lot of the OECD's focus is on, trying to help develop economies in a way that is just and not exploiting certain people within the economy, each economy. Um, so they're interested in the kinds of things that the kinds of, I guess, laws or policies that nations can put in place to help protect workers and laborers. And then they also try to promote practices that will not impact the environment in a very negative way. And this all kind of works hand in hand because the OECD believes that when the environment is clean and safe, that's a better environment for economic development and for worker safety. And so that is a lot of what they do and what their goals are as an organization. All right, so you have now been introduced to at least 5 of the most prominent and important intergovernmental organizations that we have that help to build cooperation across the global economy. You might think about these organizations in ways that are similar to the United Nations. In a sense, they are aspirational organizations. They seek to improve the lives of people within member nations, and they have high hopes for making the world a better place, to help grow the economy, to raise the health and the life expectancy and overall well-being of people around the world. And so in many ways, these are great organizations. I will point out, though, that there's a downside to these organizations, and that is that they really don't have much power to impose these policies or to enforce these policies on their member nations. And so while that's why I say it's aspirational. While they have high hopes, while they have big ambitions, ultimately it's really up to the member nations to commit to following through with the commitments that they make via these different organizations. So I think you could look around the world and you could find a lot of great work being done by the IMF, by the World Bank, by the WTO and the G20, and you can see the benefit that exists in having these organizations work together. But at the same time, there's always a risk that some of the objectives that they have organizationally will fall through just because there isn't an enforcement mechanism for many of the policies. So just something to keep in mind as we discuss these different intergovernmental organizations.